Alright everyone, welcome back. It's been actually 8 months. So we're pausing probably permanently the series on human nature. We'll see. These videos are gonna go until I finish my dissertation. Look at my little hairs. So it's gonna be articles that relate to what I'm working on for my dissertation that I think are interesting and also that I will need to know more in depth for the research that I will be doing. I'm so excited. Thanks for joining me. Let's go learn new cool things. Yay! Alright, let's try this without the little microphone thing. This is not supported. Me and technology, still not friends. It's been a long time, and I kind of gave up on that series about human nature. I may or may not get back to it. I got really irritated trying to read the author's perspective on what Marx's perspective of human nature was, so as you might imagine. So then I quit, and then my life has been chaos, and now here we are. So I'm going to go back to doing these because it really helps me process what I'm reading, and now that I'm trying to read more shit for my dissertation. So this article I actually may have already done a video about because I also used it for my master's thesis, but I completely forgot everything about it, and it's going to be like critical for everything I'm doing. So here's where we're starting. So the article is called "Nothing About Us Without Us: Reading Protests Against Oppressive Knowledge Production as Guidelines for Solidarity Research." So the author is Dilara Yarbrough, and it's from 2019. So study subjects are unhoused people as well as sex workers. So the research question in this article is an intellectual ethnography of protests by poor people and sex workers against oppressive forms of knowledge production, analyzing the protesters' opposition to research that trades in pathologization. Analyzing the protesters' opposition to research that trades in pathologization, paternalism, and extractive exotification, I distill guiding questions for scholars who want to do what I call solidarity research. That's why this is important to me in my project. Characterized by a politics of humility, dialogue, and accountability to marginalized groups fighting for transformative change. So we're gonna start with the main reason I even started making these videos is, what do those words even fucking mean? So the three big things the author is talking about is oppressive knowledge and the way that it pathologizes, uses paternalism, and extractive exotification. So pathologization. The pathologization of poor people is endemic to social science research and has been perhaps the most powerful ideational force shaping U.S. poverty policy. Whoa, that's a lot of weird, confusing fucking words. So, to define pathologizing is to describe or categorize something as psychologically abnormal or unhealthy. So, pathologizing poor people means saying they're poor because their brain is in some way bad or dysfunctional or unhealthy. Some good examples we've seen of how pseudoscience can try to uphold other oppressive views are the idea that AIDS, when we first discovered it, was a gay virus, the science around racial inferiority, and the broken windows theory, which Castro actually talks about in this article. So all of those have been disproven, right? They're not science anymore, but some of those theories, specifically the broken windows theory, is still used to guide policy decisions today. And so just to elaborate on what the broken windows theory is, it's the idea that poverty-related disorder, so things like unhoused encampments or broken street windows or visible prostitution or graffiti, that those types of things attract more serious crime, and that the solution to that is an increase in policing of low-level quality of life and property crime in order to prevent violence. So there's no data to back up that sentiment, and it has been used and is generally accepted within our cultural narrative as common sense, which directly leads to things like the unfathomable police budgets that we see, as well as the militarization of our police forces nationally. One down. Okay, so paternalism is when someone with power, people whatever with power or authority use that power or authority to restrict the freedoms of those without said power or authority. So in this specific context, the author talks about expert authority, which is gained through completing your doctoral coursework. People that have done that, so people with a doctorate, are socialized to believe that they know what is best for certain populations because they have extensive research knowledge about them. I don't usually talk to myself this much, so it's a lot of talking for me right now. However, some really good follow-up questions to this assumption are: has the expert ever been part of or experienced what it is like to be part of the community that their research is focusing on or speaking about? So what makes someone an expert in a specific field or experience? These questions relate a lot to another article I'll probably do a video for that's called Racism, the Language of Reduced Recidivism and Higher Education in Prison Toward an Anti-Racist Praxis by, that is not by Aaron Castro. So basically the idea of that article, the anti-racist praxis article, is that the language of recidivism stems from, and recidivism is like being reincarcerated. So if you've gone to prison and you've been released, and it's defined in a lot of different ways, which is part of what I'm working through in my dissertation right now. But so recidivism is that being released and then being rearrested. So language of recidivism stems from and simultaneously upholds systemic racism. So an expert that focuses all of their research on recidivism without including the impacted community's input or perspective is inadvertently upholding the carceral system that creates recidivism and the need to research recidivism in the first place. It's a feedback loop. Another concept that relates to this that I don't have any specific article in mind to talk about, but I've seen content talking about this, the idea of an expert is actually a colonial concept. So prior to colonization and the erasure of indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, there was not this very like ivory tower university concept of someone that knows best or is an expert in a thing, in opposition to like community census, people deciding together what is best for them versus an outside expert coming in and being like, oh, I know all about recidivism, let me tell you how to not have people go back to jail without ever having talked to somebody that has been arrested and then rearrested. So in this article, Castro talks about experiences of sex workers being excluded from a panel advocating for more policing that labels sex workers as victims of interpersonal violence without ever asking for their input, and not just not asking for their input, specifically refused to meet with the sex work advocates to talk about the issue. There is frequently, and like I would very much argue, consciously a conflation. So using sex work and sex trafficking to mean the same thing. But obviously, I hope it's clear in this house we support sex work. Two down. Okay, last one. Extractive exotification. That one's even hard to say. What does that even mean? So extractive means taking things away from their original or rightful place. So usually we see that used in reference to our natural resources, right? Like natural resource extraction, taking it from where it is to where we're going to put it to be able to produce whatever goods it is that we need. While exotification is a process in which you attribute a set of stereotypes to a person based on their appearances and how they fall outside of the norm. So obviously, in the examples provided by Castro, even public policy advocates use stereotypes and exotification to guide or push for legislation that impacts those marginalized groups. So one conflict that the author talks about that researchers face when publishing works about marginalized populations is how to avoid respectability politics. So how to select the stories or anecdotes that best support the research findings without choosing to omit stories that reinforce certain stereotypes or that make participants look bad while also trying to avoid the exact reinforcement of those stereotypes. So as Castro says, so quote from the article, one way to decide which details to jettison is to evaluate whether the stories are useful in understanding how state violence works and how we can fight back, or whether the stories merely satisfy outsiders' prurient interest in how marginalized people survive. So if it's sensational and it may like entice people to read it, but it doesn't really support what you're trying to say, it's not worth putting in there. But if the story ties into the findings or the point you're trying to make or the policy you're trying to advocate for, then it's probably worth including. We already kind of touched on this, but circling back to like what is words are hard, so many sounds, my cat eating, police. So what makes someone an expert? So another quote, direct quote from the article, solidarity research means constant reflection about and negotiation of the role of expert. I put the quotes, not the author. Highlighting the academic rigor of our studies while demanding an end to exclusionary and paternalistic approaches that then deny the expertise that comes from lived experience. So one example that the author has is someone holding a sign that says that they have a PhD in being unhoused and or poverty. So exactly, so like a person that comes from a white collar background that has a PhD in socioeconomic inequality but has never experienced poverty, who's an expert? All right, this might actually be relatively short because those were the main points of the things that needed clarifying or defining, and then the main point of the article actually just goes back to the title and also that slogan, nothing about us without us. So the full title, Reading Protests Against Oppressive Knowledge Production as Guidelines for Solidarity Research. So by attending protests with their research participants against events held by experts, Castro was able to look more deeply in the way that we produce knowledge and intentionally or unintentionally exclude certain voices from that process, as well as propose guidelines for people like myself that plan to do research with marginalized communities for how to include those participants throughout the process conducting research. Without like sensationalizing the findings and using that research and that experience as the researcher to advocate for changes in the conditions that made that research necessary in the first place. Solidarity. I'm so excited about this article. I used it in my thesis, but I hope in this project that I can incorporate it more and throughout the whole thing, because that's kind of what a theoretical framework is for, and I just don't know that I did a good job with that the first time, but that's why we're gonna get the PhD, I guess. Who knows? If you have questions, definitely put them in the comments, because really thinking about these things helps me process better. So now when I go and add this part to my dissertation, chapter 1, hopefully it'll make more sense. Otherwise, beautiful people, thanks for joining me again. Hopefully it's not another 6 months. Go forth and do good things.